Hi, my name's Jessica Eaton and I've been asked today to talk to you about trauma-informed practice, victim blaming and what we can do better to support people who are subjected to sexual violence. So I've been given some questions to answer and I'm going to try and answer them as much as I can in this video. I'm sorry that I can't be there. But yeah, hopefully, this video will spark conversation, start debate, and that's what we should be aiming for in this field at the moment, is debate, critical conversation. So for those of you that don't know me and are wondering why I am on this screen, my name is Jessica Eaton and I am an international specialist researcher, writer, speaker, author in the psychology of sexual violence. My PhD, which is just finished, specialised in the psychology of victim blaming. Like, why is it that we are just not yet comfortable to place all of the blame on sex offenders for sexual violence and abuse? We're always looking for what's wrong with the victim, what's wrong with their family, what was wrong with their character, what was wrong with their behaviour, what led this to happen. I'm really interested in why we do that as a group of the general public, also as a group of professionals. So I founded Victim Focus, and Victim Focus, you can go on the website, it's victimfocus.org.uk. Loads of resources on there, lots of them free, all of them as affordable as possible. Lots of free videos, e-learning, blogs, things like that. And essentially the ethos of Victim Focus is to challenge victim blaming and to push the agenda of a trauma-informed, strength-based, anti-victim blaming approach in our practice, in our policy, and just generally in the way that we work. Okay, so the first question that you've asked me, so the questions are over there. To what extent do you think that victim blaming is still happening, and how do you address it locally, and how do you identify it? I guess the first part of that question is about, how common is victim blaming? We're still at a place where we are blaming victims of sexual abuse, sexual violence, sexual traumas. The answer is yes. We are absolutely still in that place. So research tends to show us that between a third and a half of participants in studies will blame victims of sexual violence. And interestingly, that doesn't actually go down in professionals. Some people and I understand why they would assume it, but they would assume that if you're working in this field, so say for example you work in children's services, or you work in the police, or you work in domestic violence or sexual violence services, that you would actually be less likely to blame victims of sexual violence. But that's not true. We tend to have the same levels and values around victim blaming as the general public, with no education and no experience of this. So I've always found that really interesting, because that sort of suggested to me that this isn't actually about education. That means that it doesn't matter necessarily that you have, worked in this field for 17 years and you know a lot about it, if your value base is that you don't believe victims, or you think they're making it up, or you think that they could have done something differently, or that their actions or their behaviours or their dress sense led to what happened, then you're going to hold those values anyway, even if you work in this field. So that I guess is a little bit alarming, but also interesting, because it means that we need to consider our approach and not just assume that training people will reduce victim blaming, because it's not necessarily based on knowledge. It's actually based on values and our beliefs about women, about sexual violence, about sex offenders, about society, about justice, fairness, hierarchy, and all of our beliefs around that then influence whether we blame victims or not. So identifying it, a lot of you will be thinking, well, you've definitely already identified it. You'll have read case notes where children, have been recorded as promiscuous, or that their actions led to being sexually exploited or abused, or that, they wear this, they wear a lot of makeup, they go down here, they don't listen to their parents. So it's usually quite easy to identify. However, there is what I call more subtle victim blaming, like palatable victim blaming, And we have a lot of that in practice. And that's not the, oh, she's a slag, or well, you know, he's from this family. That's that overt victim blaming. You can tell what that is. That's really easy to identify. But it's the subtle stuff. So, for example, a professional saying, well, you know, she does have a lot of vulnerabilities, and the vulnerabilities led to being sexually abused. Like, no, they didn't. A sex offender led to her being sexually abused. So that's that subtle victim blaming. Or, for example, you might work with a professional or a group of professionals that say, oh, these children keep being trafficked and sexually exploited, and they just won't leave. You know, we've given them all the information, we've done healthy relationships work with them, we've taught them about consent, and they won't leave. You know, they're putting themselves in this position. That's that subtle victim blaming. That's sort of saying, we've given them all the information, so why won't they just go? Why won't they leave? This is their fault now. So identifying it is sometimes about, you know, how overt is it? How subtle is it? How is our language being used to blame victims of sexual violence? So one of the other questions that's here is about the way that a lot of our campaigns to prevent sexual violence are actually focused on getting the victims to change their lives and their behaviours, when we don't really do a lot of preventative work with perpetrators. And that's true, you know, that comment is true. And I guess we do a lot of that. My research has shown that. I interviewed women who had experienced different forms of sexual violence, and professionals told them, you know, it's because of what you looked like, it was because of the things you went through when you were a kid, it was because you went out drinking, it was because you left your friends on a night out, it was because you're too naive, it's because you've been using Tinder. And so they were told, you know, if you don't want this to happen to you again, you change something about yourself. You know, stop using dating apps, don't use unlicensed taxis, or don't get into, I don't know, a hackney cab. Don't leave your friends on a night out. Stop wearing that. Stop presenting yourself like this. Maybe you should meet better people. Maybe you should change your friend group. And it's, you know, maybe you shouldn't walk home alone. Maybe you shouldn't be putting pictures of yourself on Instagram. And it's, you know, if you were to follow all of the safety advice that we're actually given to not be sexually assaulted or raped, you would never leave your house. You would, I mean, not only would you not leave your house, you wouldn't live with another human. So this is what interests me, right, about the sexual violence prevention stuff, is that statistically you are extremely unlikely to be attacked sexually by a stranger in an unfamiliar environment at night, walking home, by someone you don't know. I think that's in a very, very rare form of sexual violence. The majority of all sexual violence occurs in the home, from your partner or your parents or your carers, in a living room or a bedroom, or, you know, in the bathroom, okay? So actually, if we were to use the actual real statistics of sexual violence to then develop a real prevention campaign, the advice would be, do not live with humans, live alone, do not live with your family, just exist alone forever. Never date, never get married, because, you know, all of the statistics show that you're most at risk from a partner or an ex-partner. You're most at risk in your own home. Like, if we were to take this prevention stuff seriously, it would basically be like, live on your own in like a box, don't ever talk to humans, maybe live on an island. Like, and it's stupid. We can't keep doing this. We don't do it with any other form of crime to the level that we do this, you know. We don't say to people, don't go out, don't go to clubs, don't go here, don't go there, don't do this, don't speak to this person, don't look a certain way because you might get stabbed. Like, nobody says that because it's stupid. So the prevention stuff is really interesting, because if you were to flip it right over, the people we should be doing prevention work with is potential and existing sex offenders. And what I mean by potential sex offenders is basically the entire population. Because you never know who is going to be sexually abusive in a relationship or with a stranger. So it would mean, like, true prevention strategies would be universal strategies from very young children. And we're only just getting to the point where we accept that kids need decent sex ed. So what I'm saying might be decades off yet, but I'm talking about open, frank conversations and education with kids from the point they can talk about boundaries, about how to treat other humans, about sex, about relationships, about feelings, about manipulation, jealousy, lying, feelings of wanting to hurt other people, anything like that, just to the point where it becomes so open and so frank that people stop being scared of these conversations, so that, you know, we can try and tackle this stuff super, super, super early. The other thing I think that's really important is tackling the hypersexualization of society, the hypersexualization of kids from a really young age, the objectification and hypersexualization of girls and women, the masculinization of men, the fact that men and boys are expected to fit this masculine gender role where they love sex and they love fighting and they love violence and you know, they love competition and things like that. Like we've got a lot of really harmful messages in society that are actually contributing to sexual violence, and we're not tackling any of them. We're doing it in this really individualistic way where we're saying that person is a sex offender and we need to figure out why that person did that thing, which would make sense if it was rare. But actually the British Crime Survey last year found that 1 in 5 British adults said they were abused in childhood, so it's not rare, which means that this individualistic approach of like, why did that sex offender abuse that child, is irrelevant, because we're talking a global problem. This is in, you know, 1 in 5 people's lives. So if we're going to keep trying to individualise the problem into people's brains or into their behaviour and ignore society, we will never ever tackle this. So one of the questions that's on here is, what would you say in response to those who are concerned about services that focus on women's needs and sort of ask us what about the men? I'm never going to get away from that blog. Okay, so I obviously last year I wrote a blog that went super duper viral called Stop Asking Me What About the Men. And this comes from, like, I set up a male mental health centre and still fund it. I'm still the chair. But actually it was more about the fact that when I talk about the work that I do with men, everybody thinks I'm a hero. I was like, oh, isn't that amazing? That's such great work, and you know, men really need support, men need to talk to, and like, and that's great and everything. But when I talk about women's needs, I just get people telling me, what about men? You know, like, well, what about boys? What about men? Like, oh, I didn't see you asking me what about the women and what about the girls when I was talking about male mental health. So there's this like really interesting pattern that I noticed, and I guess what I would say to you is that when people listen to you talk about global oppression and exploitation and violence and rape against women, FGM, trafficking, forced marriage, and their only response to you is, yeah, but what about men and boys? They are derailing that conversation on purpose. They're not interested in men and boys at all. If they did, they would be out working with men and boys or donating their money or setting up projects for men and boys. And they're not. They're just there to derail the conversation. And the issue I have with that, especially what I've seen in CSE, is this constant assertion that, CSE happens equally to boys and girls. It's just that boys don't disclose. That's not true. There is nothing to back that up at all. Globally, girls are much more likely to be raped, sexually abused, trafficked, killed in every single country than boys are. It is very likely that boys don't disclose as much as girls do, but girls also don't disclose. In terms of disclosure of sexual violence, it's about 13 to 17% ever disclosed to a service or to the police. So, you know, you can't just say, well, boys and men aren't disclosing. But even if they were, it's never, ever going to reach the levels of historical or current numbers around the abuse of women and girls in every country globally. And I think this like move to try and convince us that CSE, CSA, rape, sexual violence is not a gendered issue. Like, it's nothing to do with the sex of who these people are. It's just something that happens to everyone. I think is a deliberate way of forcing us to stop talking about the way women and girls are treated in society, and you know, to make us almost apologise for that. Like, oh, sorry, I should have said boys as well. no, like we're talking about women and girls right now, so we'll talk about boys and men another time. And it's just so interesting that derailment only happens when you're talking about women and girls. And like I said, I've honestly, in all the talks, training, speeches, if I talk about the abuse of men and boys, mental health of men and boys, trauma, violence, the experiences that they've had, and the way that they're forced into gender roles in society, nobody stops me and says, why aren't you talking about women and girls? And so that's when I started to realise there was definitely a silencing agenda here whenever we talked openly about women and girls. Like a good example is that I did a really large study about men's mental health and well-being and how services should approach that, and didn't get any abuse, didn't get any hate mail, didn't get any death threats. And then about 2 years later, I did a study about the victim blaming of women and girls and how that, and what people thought about that in society. And at the end of the study, and this is in my new book actually, at the end of the study, there is a free text box, and it was asking people, they were supposed to be writing about, their experience of taking the study. So, was it okay? Was it boring? Was it too long? Was it distressing? Do you need any further support? And an alarming proportion of comments were just people giving me abuse and saying, but what about men? Like, why isn't this study about men? Why did you leave men out? And yeah, I was absolutely gobsmacked how many people said that. So the last question is about trauma-informed approaches, and this is something that I'm really passionate about. It's something that Victim Focus is committed to, is really pushing for true trauma-informed practice, because, and I say true because it's become a bit of a buzzword. People keep sort of saying it, and then when I go out and I'm teaching or doing consultancy, people aren't 100% sure exactly what it means. And so this is a good opportunity, I guess, to talk about what it means to me, and why we should be moving towards it. So one of the things that happens with in sexual trauma and abuse is obviously you develop loads of coping mechanisms, behaviours, symptoms, feelings, thoughts, and at the moment, under the medical model of mental health, that would mean eventually someone would say you were mentally ill, that you have a psychiatric diagnosis that needs to be tested and needs to be potentially medicated and treated. And that can lead to people being diagnosed with bipolar, people being diagnosed with borderline personality disorder or emotionally unstable personality disorder. And actually, that's not a trauma-informed approach. A trauma-informed approach would argue that if somebody has been through something extremely distressing, rapes, abuse, trafficking, neglect, domestic violence, then their behaviours and their thoughts and their ways of coping are going to be abnormal and extreme. But what's interesting about them is when you dig into them, they're not abnormal or extreme. They're actually normal and rational. So, for example, people who control particular elements of their lives after abuse, that's a normal response for someone who's been out of control for a long period of time. Interesting things like children who have been abused and neglected, who then struggle to form relationships with professional support workers and carers, will very quickly get labelled as having an attachment disorder. But actually they are displaying natural, normal, healthy behaviours. If they have only ever been treated in a particular way by adults, and then a new adult comes on the scene and tells them, I'm safe, I'm going to look after you, I'm here for you, why should they believe you? And so they will treat you with the same disdain they've treated everybody else. They keep you at arm's length. They don't engage with you. They don't connect with you. They don't trust you. That's normal. I would actually argue that child is in a learning process. And what they're trying to do is protect themselves. So actually they're in a process right now of self-preservation. That kid is not mentally ill. That kid does not have a disorder. That kid has learned how to protect themselves from adults who have harmed them. So a true trauma-informed approach looks at those things. So if you have For example, children that have panic attacks and they're triggered by particular things, that doesn't mean that they have an anxiety disorder. That means that their brain is responding to particular stimuli in the environment, and they've learned that that might mean danger. So their body responds to that danger. That they're not mentally ill. That's actually exactly what the human body should do. If we were in the wild, if we were still, if we were to go back a few million years, that's exactly what we should be doing. Is that if something was very dangerous and then we saw that stimuli again, you're supposed to have a big fear response to it, and you're supposed to run away or fight it. And so actually, a lot of the things that we are diagnosing people with are not real. Especially children that have been sexually abused and exploited, where kids are being told they have personality disorders and bipolar. And what professionals are not being taught is that you can't get those labels off. So once that kid is labelled with a psychiatric diagnosis, it is incredibly difficult to get it removed. Don't think for a moment that there's just some letter that you write, or the child will present to a psychiatrist or a CPN and they'll go, oh, all their symptoms have gone, that must mean there's nothing wrong with them. That's not what happens. I still have women and girls writing to me from all over the country saying, I don't know how to get these labels off, and I don't think I'm mentally ill, but I'm being told I am. And actually I think it was just trauma, and then I've worked through that trauma, but they won't take the label off, and they're telling me that I have to keep taking the medication for the rest of my life. We have to accept that we're influencing that. We are in a very strange model where in some cases psychiatric diagnosis of the children opens up interventions, treatments, funding, particular services that you're then allowed to access with that child. So we're trapped at the moment, and our practice is not trauma informed. It's very medicalised. It's about seeking out what's wrong with the child and then labelling them with it and then treating them for it, rather than sort of having that conversation about, look at all of these things this child has lived through, look at the behaviours and the thoughts that have resulted because they're trying to survive. That to me is a true trauma-informed approach. No labelling, no stigma, no diagnosis, just working with them as a human, as a whole human that is not mentally ill, they're not disordered, they don't have a psychiatric problem, they're actually just responding to extreme distress. So thank you for asking me those questions, and thank you for listening to me. If you managed to get all the way through that video. You are absolutely welcome to come along to Victim Focus events. I'm doing a tour next year, and a lot of the tickets still are free because I made about 2,500 tickets for free, so people could, come along. Lots of different dates all over the country. Obviously come along to the website, loads of resources, loads of interesting stuff at www.victimfocus.org.uk.